My phone vibrated while I was slicing lemons for iced tea. A message from my son. Mom, we need you to leave the house tonight. Madison's parents feel uncomfortable. We need privacy. Leave. My own house. I read it 3 times. The knife slipped from my fingers. And in that second something inside me shifted. If my son chose his in-laws over his mother, was he ready for what would happen before midnight? I'm glad you're here. If stories about family betrayal and quiet strength resonate with you, stay with me. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. That morning, I had no idea everything was about to fall apart. The lake was perfectly still, stretched out like a sheet of brushed silver beneath the early sun. Pine trees along the shore carried that faint, resinous scent that always reminds me of clean linen and long summers. I opened the kitchen windows to let the air in. It felt like the kind of day that promises peace. I woke before everyone else, as I always do when we have guests. Old habits do not fade. They settle into the bones. I pressed my robe flat at the waist, tied my hair back neatly, and began preparing breakfast with the quiet precision that has followed me my entire adult life. Croissants warmed slowly in the oven. I sliced fruit into careful, even pieces and arranged them on the porcelain platter I bought years ago when Ethan received his first real promotion. Fresh flowers from my own garden, white hydrangeas, sat in a low glass vase at the center of the patio table. Everything was intentional. Everything was mine. Madison was already outside when I carried the coffee pot to the table. She sat angled toward the lake, legs crossed, scrolling her phone with that detached expression young women wear when the world exists mainly behind glass. She barely looked up. Morning, she said. Her mother, Patricia, stood near the flower beds with her hands folded behind her back, studying my roses as though evaluating property rather than blossoms. She bent slightly to inspect a bloom, lips pursed in quiet calculation. They would benefit from a cleaner landscape line, she murmured. More symmetry. I smiled politely. They've grown that way for 20 years. Harold sat at the patio table reading the newspaper. Every so often he made a low humming sound, disapproval directed at headlines no one else had asked about. Ethan came out last. He leaned down and kissed my cheek, the gesture quick but familiar. Thanks for hosting, Mom. Hosting. The word brushed against me lightly, but I remember noticing it. Not thanks for having us home. Not thanks for letting us stay. Just hosting. As though I were a venue. We ate in the mild sunlight. The silverware clinked softly against porcelain. Birds moved along the edge of the dock. It all appeared ordinary, but small details like hairline cracks in glass were already forming. Madison mentioned the house felt a bit dated. Patricia asked if I had ever considered opening the kitchen to create a more modern flow. Harold commented that young couples need space to build their future properly. Each remark was delivered gently, almost thoughtfully. I responded with measured smiles. I did not yet understand that they were not discussing design. They were discussing transition. When I rose to refill the coffee cups, I paused near the sliding doors and looked back at them, my son seated between his wife and her parents, nodding along to something Patricia was explaining. He did not look at me. And still I told myself everything was fine. Because mothers are trained to smooth over tension before it has a chance to speak its name. I remember noticing the way Madison rested her hand lightly on Ethan's arm whenever property was mentioned. Not affection, positioning. As if anchoring him to a direction already chosen. I returned to the table and poured coffee carefully, steady hands, steady breath. The lake shimmered beyond the railing. Sunlight reflected in fractured patterns across the water's surface, beautiful and blinding at once. That morning I believed I was sharing my home. I did not yet realize they were quietly measuring it. And I certainly did not realize they were already planning my absence within it. The first real blow came at lunch, not in a raised voice or slammed door, but in the casual way Madison spoke as if my home were already a draft version of their future. We ate in the dining room because Patricia said the patio felt windy, though there was hardly a breath of air. I had set the table with the good plates, white porcelain with a thin gold rim, and the heavy silverware Ethan used to call fancy when he was a teenager. The napkins were folded into neat rectangles, pressed so sharply they held their shape like paper. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't anyone's birthday. I did it anyway. That is what I've always done. I made ordinary days look cared for because I believed care changed the atmosphere of a room. Madison sat to Ethan's right. Patricia sat beside her daughter like a quiet supervisor. Harold took the seat at the head of the table without asking, newspaper still folded under his arm as though he might need it to defend himself from conversation. I served lemon rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, bread still warm. The scent was familiar, my scent, the one that has lived in these walls for decades. I watched Patricia taste the food with the careful expression of a woman deciding whether something is worth keeping. "It's lovely," she said, in the same tone people use to compliment a hotel. Harold chewed and nodded once, as if approving a proposal. Ethan tried to make it light. He asked about the drive. He mentioned the lake looks different in late spring. He laughed at something Madison showed him on her phone, and for a few moments I allowed myself to breathe. Then Madison set her fork down and looked past me, toward the wall that separates the kitchen from the living room. "We could tear down this wall," she said. "Make it ours." "Ours. Not your home is beautiful. Not this house has good bones. Not even maybe one day. Ours." The word sat on the table between the plates like a dropped piece of glass. I waited for Ethan to correct her. For him to laugh and say, "It's Mom's house." The way he would have said it before marriage turned him careful. But he didn't. He reached for his water, took a sip, and stared at the chicken as if the seasoning suddenly needed his full attention. Patricia smiled. Not warmly, strategically. "Open concept would modernize everything," she added. "It would raise the value too." Harold wiped his mouth and finally looked directly at me. "You've done well," he said, as though I were an employee he didn't particularly like but couldn't deny was competent. "But young families need space to build their future." Young families build their future. The language was neat and reasonable, which is what made it dangerous. Reasonable words are the easiest ones to hide greed inside. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my face calm. Years of negotiating bills, schedules, emergencies, years of being the stable one, had trained me to respond without emotion showing first. "That wall has been there since the house was built," I said lightly. Madison shrugged. "Walls can change." Her eyes flicked to Ethan again, just for a second, like a silent reminder of who she expected to agree with her. I stood to clear plates because movement gives you something to do with your hands when your heart starts behaving like an animal in a trap. I carried dishes to the kitchen, rinsed them slowly, listened to their voices continue behind me, low, confident, assuming. When I returned, Harold was talking about how smart it is to restructure assets early. Patricia was describing renovations she had helped oversee for a friend. Madison nodded along, already envisioning new countertops and new furniture, as if my presence were just a temporary inconvenience to schedule around. Ethan stayed quiet. That silence told me more than any sentence. A few minutes later, while I was slicing lemons for iced tea, trying to restore normalcy through habit, my phone vibrated on the counter. Ethan's name on the screen. "Mom, we need you to leave the house tonight. Madison's parents feel uncomfortable. We need privacy. Leave. Tonight. My own house." I stared at the message until the words blurred. My fingers went cold. The knife slipped and hit the counter with a hard clack that sounded louder than it should have. I didn't cry. Not then. I simply stood there with lemon juice on my fingertips, listening to the murmur of my son and his wife in the next room, and I understood something with a clarity so sharp it almost felt calm. This wasn't about privacy. It was about erasing me. I watched him through the glass doors. My grown son stood beside his wife, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes fixed on some invisible point on the floor as if the wood grain might offer him a solution. Madison was close to him, too close, not touching but positioned the way people stand when they want the room to understand who belongs to whom. I could see his mouth move. A brief sentence. A small nod. Not toward me. Away from me. My chest tightened in a way I recognized immediately, because the body keeps its own record of fear. It does not care how old your child is or how many years have passed since you last felt helpless. It simply returns you to the same internal weather. For a moment the kitchen felt too bright. The lemons on the cutting board looked almost fluorescent, their pulp glossy and exposed. My hands were damp from citrus and cold water, and still I couldn't make myself pick the knife back up. I thought absurdly of how Ethan used to hate lemon slices floating in drinks, "It tastes like cleaner," he would say, wrinkling his nose, and I would laugh and take them out for him, because that is what mothers do. Remove small discomforts before they become real complaints. Now he was asking me to remove myself. I leaned my fingertips against the counter and breathed slowly until my heart steadied. Through the glass, I saw him shift his weight from one foot to the other. An old habit, the same restless sway he had as a boy when he wanted to confess something but hoped it would disappear if he delayed long enough. And without warning, memory came in the way it always does. Not like a story you choose to revisit, but like a door that opens in your mind and pulls you through. Ethan was 7. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and plastic. A cartoon played on a muted television while machines beeped steadily beside his bed. He was pale, too small under the stiff white sheet. His fingers curled around mine as if letting go would mean falling. "Mom," he whispered, voice thin and frightened. "Don't leave." I told him I wouldn't. I told him I was right there, that I'd stay until he was asleep, and then I stayed longer. I stayed through the night, through the morning, through the moment he woke up crying and reached for me without opening his eyes. Sure, I might have vanished. I promised myself then that his fear would never be lonely. And I kept that promise for decades. I kept it when his father walked out, quietly, efficiently, as if abandoning us were a business decision. I kept it when Ethan cried into my sweater the first night his father didn't come home. I kept it when money was tight and the refrigerator was too empty, when the car needed repairs and the school wanted fees, when I learned to stretch paychecks like dough and smile as if nothing hurt. I worked overtime. I took extra shifts. I learned the language of contractors and bank officers and insurance policies. I saved and saved until I could buy this house by the lake. Not a mansion, not a showpiece, but solid, safe ours. Every beam, every window, every nail earned. This home was never just a place to live. It was proof. Proof that a woman could be abandoned and still build something that stood straight. Proof that my son would have stability even if I had to sacrifice everything else to give it to him. Proof that we survived. And perhaps that is what made me convenient. Reliable. Available. A foundation people assume will always be there, even when they stop noticing what it cost to pour it. I looked again through the glass doors and saw Ethan laugh softly at something Patricia said. A small laugh, polite, strained. He still would not meet my eyes. Something settled inside me then. Not anger, not grief, but a quieter realization that felt almost clinical. He had learned to keep peace with other people by spending mine. I understood, too, that this moment had not begun today. It had been forming slowly, fed by small permissions I didn't recognize as dangerous. Every time I stayed silent to avoid conflict. Every time I swallowed hurt because they didn't mean it that way. Every time I told myself I should be grateful my son still included me at all. And now the bill had arrived. My hands finally stopped trembling. I dried them on the towel hanging from the oven handle, smoothing the fabric as if neatness could return order to what was happening. Through the glass, Madison turned slightly and glanced toward the kitchen. Her eyes passed over me with brief, cool acknowledgement, like checking whether a door is still unlocked. Then she leaned in to whisper something to Ethan. He nodded. And I knew, with the same certainty I once felt in that hospital room, that the next decision would determine the shape of everything after it. Only this time the person who needed protection was not my child. It was me. When Ethan first introduced Madison to me, she arrived with a cherry pie in both hands and a smile that seemed almost rehearsed in its warmth. "It's homemade," she said, stepping into my kitchen as if she already understood its layout. I wanted to make a good impression. She called me Mom before the evening was over. At the time, I mistook confidence for sincerity. She complimented my house, my resilience, my career. She asked thoughtful questions about how I built everything alone after Ethan's father left. She listened carefully, head slightly tilted, eyes intent in a way that felt flattering. "You're very strong," she told me once. I admire women who don't depend on anyone. There was something about that sentence I could never quite place. It sounded like praise, but it carried a faint aftertaste, like fruit that looks perfect but bruises under pressure. Still, I welcomed her. I invited her to Sunday dinners. I shared family recipes. I gave her a spare key when she and Ethan started staying overnight. I told myself that inclusion builds loyalty. The first red flag was small enough to dismiss. "You and Ethan are very close," she said one evening while helping me clear plates. Her voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. It's sweet, but he needs to learn independence. I smiled, though something in her tone felt measured. I raised him to stand on his own, I replied. She nodded, but her eyes remained steady on mine, assessing. Over time, the adjustments were subtle. Ethan stopped dropping by alone. When I suggested lunch, Madison often had plans. If Ethan called, it was usually on speaker. Once, when I mentioned a memory from his childhood, Madison laughed lightly and said, "He's not a little boy anymore, Mom." The word mom had shifted. It no longer felt like belonging. It felt like positioning. Then came the financial conversations. Madison had ideas. Small ventures, retreats, branding consultations. Each required modest startup funds. Nothing extravagant at first, just enough to show I believed in her. Investment in family, she would say with a soft smile. Ethan assured me they were building something stable. Meanwhile, small comments about the house began appearing more frequently. This place could really appreciate in value with the right updates. You ever think about downsizing? Something easier to manage? One afternoon, a local realtor I've known for years ran into me at the grocery store. "So," she said casually, "when are you transferring the property to them?" I froze. "I'm not," I answered. She blinked. "Oh," I assumed, "well, never mind." Someone had been speaking as though that decision was already made. The thought stayed with me longer than I admitted. And then there was the distance. Madison gently discouraged Ethan from visiting me alone. If he planned to stop by after work, suddenly there was an errand. If he stayed too long, she would text. I began noticing how often he glanced at his phone when we were together, as though his presence required supervision. Once I overheard her say, "We need to start thinking long-term. Assets. Security. Assets. Security." I wondered when I had become a line item in their future planning. Looking back now, the pattern is painfully clear. Madison never raised her voice. She never argued directly. She simply shifted gravity. She complimented when it benefited her. She distanced when it didn't. She framed my involvement as overreach and my support as expected. And Ethan, my son who once refused to sleep without the hallway light on, adapted. He mistook her firmness for direction. He mistook my silence for agreement. By the time we sat at that lunch table discussing tearing down walls, the groundwork had already been laid. Madison didn't need to push loudly. She had been moving pieces quietly for years. And I, believing love meant trust without verification, had allowed it. When I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and reading Ethan's message telling me to leave my own house, I finally saw the full shape of it. This was not a sudden conflict. It was the natural conclusion of a plan I had underestimated. Madison had not entered my family to belong. She had entered to rearrange. And until that moment I had mistaken strategy for sweetness. After the text I didn't cry. I stood at the sink with lemon juice drying on my fingertips, listening to the soft murmur of voices in the next room. The house was full of people, yet I felt oddly alone, like a lamp left burning in an empty room. I picked up the knife and set it down carefully, blade facing inward, the way I taught Ethan to do when he was old enough to help in the kitchen. Then I wiped the counter in slow, deliberate strokes, as if order on the surface could steady what had shifted underneath. Through the glass doors I saw my son again. He was laughing, small, polite laughter, at something Harold said. Madison's hand rested on Ethan's forearm, not affectionate, just claiming. Patricia leaned in toward them like someone advising a purchase. And I understood something with a quiet clarity that surprised me. They were not asking. They were informing. If I moved out for privacy tonight, it would become easier tomorrow. One night would turn into a weekend. A weekend would turn into, while we figure things out. Then eventually into it makes sense for you to stay elsewhere. It would be framed as kindness, as convenience, as what's best. And if I protested later, I would be the difficult one, the emotional one, the mother who can't let go. I walked into my office and closed the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of paper and cedar, the old filing cabinet, the books I never stopped keeping, the quiet life of documents. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Ethan at graduation, his smile bright, his arm around my shoulders. My face in that photo looked tired but proud. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where I keep the house records. Not because I forgot what was true, but because I needed to touch it again, proof in my own hands. The deed, the title, the insurance documents. My name printed cleanly again and again. Sole owner. No shared interest. No family transfer. No accidental misunderstanding. I took a breath and reached for my phone. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call a friend for comfort. I opened my contacts and called Martin Keene, the broker who sold my neighbor's property last year in 3 days, and never once pretended emotions mattered more than signatures. He answered on the second ring. "Renata," he said. "Everything all right?" "I need a question answered," I replied. My voice sounded steady, almost unfamiliar in its calm. "If I list my home today, how quickly could you bring me a serious buyer?" There was a pause, the kind professionals take when they sense something has changed. "For your lake frontage," he said carefully. "If the price is right, ours. But are you sure?" "I'm sure I want options," I said. "And I want them quickly." He didn't press. He knew better than to clutter a decision with sentiment. "I can be there in 40 minutes, he said. "I'll bring someone who's been looking specifically in your area. Quiet buyer. Cash ready." "Bring him," I said. And Martin used the side gate. When I ended the call, I sat very still and listened. The house made its usual sounds, the refrigerator cycling, the old clock ticking, a distant gull calling from the lake. Ordinary noises. Familiar. Almost comforting. Then I heard Madison laugh in the living room, light, careless laughter, like she was already comfortable enough to treat my space like an extension of her own. I stood, walked to the mirror above the desk, and looked at myself. My hair was pulled back. My face was composed. But my eyes had changed. There was something in them I hadn't seen in years. A refusal to be managed. I left the office and returned to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I poured iced tea into glasses. I carried a plate of lemon slices to the patio. I listened, nodded, smiled when required. Played my part. Because sometimes the cleanest power is quiet. At the edge of the driveway, tires crunched softly on gravel. A black sedan turned in, slow and confident. Martin stepped out first, crisp in his suit, holding a thin folder. Behind him was a man in his 50s with a neutral face and the posture of someone who evaluates things for a living. Hands behind his back, eyes scanning the roofline, the windows, the shoreline. A serious buyer. At my gate. And that was the moment the air inside the house changed, subtle like a pressure shift before a storm. Madison noticed first. She moved toward the window, frowning. Patricia followed, lips tightening. Ethan stood up too quickly, chair scraping. I set my glass down and walked toward the front door without rushing, without hesitating. My slippers made soft, steady sounds on the hardwood floors. Floors I paid for, floors I refinished myself once on my knees, because there was no one else to do it. I opened the door. Martin gave me a small nod, professional and understanding. The buyer's gaze settled on me, respectful but curious. Behind me, I felt my family gather like a shadow. And in that moment, I knew there would be no going back to the version of me they expected. Because within an hour, they would learn something I should have reminded them of long ago. This house was not a favor. It was mine. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I simply stepped aside and allowed Martin and the buyer to enter my home, as though this had been planned weeks ago instead of minutes. "Good afternoon," I said calmly. "Thank you for coming on short notice." The buyer was in his mid-50s, composed, carrying the quiet authority of a man who makes decisions based on numbers, not feelings. His eyes moved deliberately, crown molding window frames, the angle of the lake through the glass. He was not here for drama. He was here for value. Behind me, the room had gone still. Madison stood near the dining table, one hand resting on the back of Ethan's chair as if claiming territory. Patricia's lips parted slightly, disbelief flickering across her carefully maintained expression. Harold lowered his newspaper, folding it once with deliberate precision. "What is this?" Madison asked, forcing a brittle laugh. "You're joking, right?" "No," I replied evenly. "I've decided to sell." The words did not echo, but they carried weight. Ethan blinked, as if trying to recalibrate what he was hearing. "Mom sell?" he repeated. "Yes." Martin remained respectfully quiet. The buyer stepped closer to the window, examining the shoreline with interest, but he was listening. Everyone was. You can't just decide that in the middle of lunch, Madison said sharply. We were discussing renovations. Yes, I answered. You were. I walked to the dining table and placed the leather folder down with careful control. I opened it slowly, not theatrically, not angrily, just methodically. The deed slid onto the table. Sole owner, I said quietly. Me. Harold leaned forward immediately. Patricia joined him. Ethan stepped closer, reading the line he had likely never bothered to consider before. Madison crossed her arms. This is ridiculous, she said. No one said you didn't own it. No, I agreed. You simply asked me to leave it. The silence thickened. Ethan's throat moved as he swallowed. We just needed some privacy tonight, he said weakly. It wasn't permanent. Temporary displacement is still displacement, I replied. Then I removed the second set of documents. 3 years of bank transfers. For $1,000 every month. Labeled consistently mortgage support. There is no mortgage, I said. Harold's brows drew together as he scanned the pages. Patricia's breath grew shallow. Ethan looked at Madison. That was for your business, he said slowly. Yes, Madison answered quickly. My development projects. My retreats. Networking opportunities. I slid a smaller stack of printed receipts across the table. Hotel suites. International flights. Designer purchases. Spa resorts. I itemized everything. Madison's composure began to fracture. Her voice rose half a pitch. You went through my expenses? I went through my bank statements. The buyer shifted uncomfortably but did not leave. Martin kept his eyes lowered, professional and patient. Ethan's face changed, confusion first, then dawning realization. You told me the retreats were self-funded, he said. Madison's eyes flashed. Because you were stressed. I didn't want to burden you. With my mother's money? He asked quietly. She stepped closer to him. This is what families do. They support each other. Yes, I said calmly. They do. And then she reached for what she believed would silence all of us. I'm pregnant. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Even the buyer looked up. Ethan turned toward her, stunned. Pregnant. She nodded rapidly. I was waiting for the right moment. On the dining table, inches from her hand, sat the champagne flute she had been sipping all afternoon. Pale bubbles still clung to the rim. Patricia noticed it first. Harold's jaw tightened. Is that true? He asked, his voice lower now. Madison hesitated. Just long enough. I just found out, she said. Harold closed the folder of bank statements slowly and placed both palms flat against the wood. Deception multiplies, he said. It does not disappear. Ethan stepped back from her. Not dramatically, but visibly. A few inches. Enough to create space where certainty had stood moments before. I felt no triumph. Only clarity. This home will be listed effective immediately, I said. Private showings begin tomorrow. Madison stared at me as if trying to understand the calculation she had misjudged. You would sell your own house just to prove a point, she demanded. I held her gaze. I would protect what I built. The buyer cleared his throat gently. It's a strong property, he said. Lake access. Structural integrity is excellent. I'm prepared to make a serious offer. The words shifted the room from emotion to reality. Money speaks louder than accusation. Martin handed him preliminary paperwork. Ethan stood still, looking smaller than he had an hour ago. The sun dipped lower over the lake, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, the same floors I had refinished myself when he left for college, sanding them down layer by layer until the surface shone again. I remembered kneeling there alone, covered in dust, determined that what we built would never rot. Madison's voice had grown thin now, her earlier confidence replaced by something close to panic. You're overreacting, she said. This is extreme. No, I replied softly. This is ownership. The buyer finished his initial walkthrough and shook my hand. I'll have my attorney contact yours, he said. When the door closed behind him, the house felt different, lighter almost. Not because it was sold, but because illusion had left it. Ethan walked toward my office slowly. I followed. He stood in front of the framed graduation photo, his arm around my shoulders, my smile tired but proud. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "I did," I answered. "You just stopped listening." His shoulders sagged. In the hallway, a suitcase zipper echoed. By midnight, he was packing. Not because I forced him. Not because I demanded it. But because when truth is laid flat in the center of a room, it leaves very little space to continue pretending. There was no screaming. No slammed doors. No accusations hurled loudly enough for the neighbors to hear through their closed windows. The storm passed through quietly, and somehow that made it heavier. By 11:30, the house had divided itself into separate islands. Patricia and Harold stood near the hallway, speaking in low, measured tones. Their voices were controlled, precise, the kind of voices people use when they understand something irreversible has happened and they are already calculating the consequences. Madison sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa. Her phone was in her hand, but the screen had gone dark. She wasn't scrolling anymore. She wasn't smiling anymore. The performance had ended, and without it she looked smaller, almost uncertain of where to place her hands. Ethan was in my office. I remained in the kitchen. I picked up a glass from the counter and washed it slowly. Then I washed it again. And again. Not because it was dirty, but because repetition steadied me. The scent of lavender dish soap rose softly into the air. Water ran over my fingers. The sound filled the silence without demanding attention. For years, I believed conflict required raised voices to be real. I was wrong. The quiet that follows exposure carries far more weight. I dried the glass carefully and set it back into its place. Everything in my kitchen had a place. Every drawer organized. Every shelf deliberate. Order had always been my language. Tonight it was also my shield. At 1:45, I heard the faint scrape of a zipper. The sound carried down the hallway like a thread being pulled loose. Ethan appeared moments later, holding a navy suitcase. The same one I had bought him when he moved into his first apartment. I remembered standing beside him in this very hallway years ago, folding his shirts, reminding him to pack enough socks. He had insisted he could handle it alone. Now he stood alone again. He stopped a few feet from me. His face looked older than it had that morning. "I didn't know," he said. The words were not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. "I believe you," I replied. And I did. He had not designed the deception. He had simply allowed it. He had mistaken trust for absence of responsibility. He had chosen ease over examination. That is a quiet failure. But it is still a failure. Behind him, Madison rose from the sofa. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp, thin with disbelief. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at her as if seeing something newly visible, something that had been there all along but unnoticed. "You said we were building something together," he said slowly. "I didn't realize it was built on hiding things." Her eyes filled quickly. Tears appeared almost on command. "I was protecting you," she insisted. "From what?" he asked. There was no response ready. Patricia stepped forward then, posture straight, voice controlled. "This is not a decision to make in anger," she said. "I'm not angry," Ethan replied quietly. That was the most unsettling part. He wasn't. He was clear. He turned back to me. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 simple words. Not dramatic. Not elaborate. Not poetic. Just honest. They did not repair anything. But they mattered. I nodded once. "I know." Madison's composure cracked then. Not loudly but visibly. The tears shifted into frustration. "This is because of you," she said to me. "You're manipulating him." I met her gaze evenly. "I showed him paper," I said. "Paper doesn't manipulate." Harold's voice cut through the room with quiet finality. "We'll speak tomorrow," he told his daughter. There was no embrace. No attempt to negotiate further. At midnight, the front door opened. Cool air slipped into the hallway, carrying the faint scent of lake water and pine. Ethan stepped outside with the suitcase in his hand. Madison did not follow immediately. The door closed. The sound echoed softly through the entryway. And just like that, the marriage that had been built on quiet redirections and financial misdirection ended not with a fight, but with exposure. I locked the door. The click of the lock sounded steady, certain. The house felt larger. Not empty but restored. I walked slowly from room to room, turning off lights one by one. The dining table still bore faint impressions where documents had been spread. A lemon slice had dried slightly on the edge of a plate. A glass remained half full of melting ice. Ordinary details. Life continuing. Outside, the lake reflected only faint starlight. The water moved gently, unaffected by the drama inside these walls. I stood at the window for a long time. My son had chosen his in-laws over his mother. By midnight, he had lost both. But I had not destroyed his marriage. Truth had. And truth, once placed on a table in full light, does not scream. It simply remains. I turned off the final lamp and walked toward my bedroom. For the first time in years, I did not lie awake wondering who needed something from me in the morning. I slept. Not peacefully, but cleanly. And that, I realized as I closed my eyes, was enough. The lake was calm the next morning. So calm it almost felt indifferent. I woke before sunrise not because I had to, but because habit does not disappear simply because conflict ends. For a moment I lay still, listening for movement in the hallway. The sound of a shower running, a door closing, the quiet rhythm of someone else occupying space. There was nothing. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant call of a gull over water. The house felt different. Not empty. Unclaimed. I rose slowly and walked barefoot across the hardwood floors. The boards were cool beneath my feet. I paused at the dining table. The faint outline where papers had rested was still visible in the sheen of morning light. I ran my hand over the surface and felt no regret, only confirmation. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee the way I always do, 2 measured scoops, water filled to the marked line. The scent rose steadily, grounding and familiar. Outside, mist hovered just above the surface of the lake like a thin veil lifting. I carried my mug onto the patio. The chair Ethan used to sit in was empty. The one Madison claimed as hers remained pushed slightly back from the table, as if she expected to return. I did not move it. I sat down and watched the water. There is something humbling about a lake in early light. It does not adjust for human drama. It does not rush or protest. It simply reflects whatever stands before it. For the first time in years, I did not feel responsible for anyone else's stability. No one was waiting for a transfer. No one was negotiating my boundaries. No one was quietly measuring my usefulness. The realization did not feel triumphant. It felt spacious. Around 9 my phone rang. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said. His voice had changed overnight. It carried a weight that had not been there before. Not broken, just stripped. I'm staying at a hotel, he continued. I needed to think. I understand. There was a long pause. I should have looked at the numbers, he said. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I replied softly. You should have. Silence again. Not defensive. Reflective. I don't know what happens next, he admitted. That's all right, I said. Not knowing is honest. He exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. This time it did not feel automatic. It felt earned. Take your time, I told him. Figure out who you are without someone else telling you. When the call ended, I remained seated on the patio, coffee growing cool in my hands. For decades, my life had been organized around preventing discomfort, smoothing tension before it surfaced, funding stability before it cracked, sacrificing quietly so others could move forward without obstruction. But protection, I realized, can become interference. Sometimes love is not holding the structure together. Sometimes it is stepping back and letting gravity do its work. Later that morning, I walked through the house with fresh eyes. I opened windows. I changed the sheets in the guest room. I removed the lemon slices from the plate and rinsed the glasses. Small acts of restoration. Not because I was preparing for someone else, because I was preparing for myself. Around noon, I opened my laptop and confirmed something I had postponed for years. Ticket to Italy. Florence first. Then Lake Como. I had saved the brochures in a folder labeled Someday. Someday had arrived quietly while I was busy managing everyone else's future. I booked the flight. When the confirmation email arrived, I felt something settle in my chest. Not excitement, not escape. Permission. The house remained mine. So did my name. So did the life I built before anyone asked to inherit it. In the afternoon, I walked down to the dock and sat with my feet just above the water's surface. Sunlight flickered across small ripples. The world moved gently forward. Ethan would rebuild himself. Madison would find her own explanations. Patricia and Harold would protect their daughter as parents do. And I would finally live without being the invisible foundation beneath someone else's ambition. The lake reflected the sky without distortion. And for the first time in a long while, so did I. Sometimes love is not holding on tighter. Sometimes it is loosening your grip and allowing people to feel the weight of their own choices. I did not lose my son that night. I lost the illusion that I had to sacrifice myself to keep him close. Names and certain details have been changed for privacy. The emotions, however, are real. Now I want to ask you, if your child asked you to leave your own home for someone else's comfort, would you go quietly? Or would you finally remind them who built the walls? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There is more truth where this came from.